The story begins not in the shadow of Rome's might, but across the sea in the bustling harbours and trading ports of Carthage. Here, among the scents of spices, the sounds of merchant ships, and the shimmering Mediterranean sun, a child was born into a family destined for war. His name was Hannibal Barca, and from the very moment he could walk, the world around him spoke of Rome as both rival and menace. For Carthage, Rome was not merely another city. It was a looming presence, a power whose ambitions clashed with their own across the waters. Hannibal's father, Hamilcar Barca, had already fought against the Romans in the First Punic War, and though Carthage had lost, the determination of the Barca family remained unbroken. In their household, Rome was not only an enemy, it was a destiny that demanded reckoning. The boy's earliest memories were of military camps rather than playgrounds, of soldiers' drills instead of games, of maps and strategies whispered over firelight rather than bedtime stories. When Hannibal was still a child, his father swore him to an oath, to never be a friend of Rome, to dedicate his life to opposing her might. This oath was no casual vow. It was a ritual seared into his soul, shaping his path before he even understood its weight. Hannibal grew up with this promise like a compass, pointing always toward the inevitable clash that history would one day demand of him. Carthage itself was a marvel of the ancient world, a city built upon wealth and ingenuity. Its people commanded the seas with their powerful navy, and its merchants traded goods from Spain to the Levant. Yet its greatness carried a shadow, for Rome, a rising force on the Italian peninsula, sought to dominate the Mediterranean. The First Punic War had proven the danger Rome posed. Carthage had lost Sicily, and with it a foothold that had once ensured its dominance. The scars of that war lingered, festering resentment and fueling ambition. In this atmosphere of loss, pride, and determination, Hannibal grew into a young commander, carrying with him not only his father's teachings, but also the aspirations of an entire people. When Hamilcar died, Hannibal came under the guidance of his brother-in-law Hasdrubal the Fair, who led Carthaginian forces in Spain. Spain was more than a distant colony. It was the key to Carthage's resurgence. Its mines provided silver to finance armies, its lands gave sustenance, and its warriors offered strength. For Hannibal, Spain was both training ground and inheritance. Here he learned the arts of war not only from books or lectures, but from the grit of campaigns, the rhythm of marches, the chaos of battlefields. He grew into a leader whom men respected and feared, not because of privilege, but because he shared their hardships, endured their hunger, and rode at the front when danger loomed. When Hasdrubal was assassinated, the army in Spain turned to Hannibal, and though still young, he commanded their loyalty. His charisma was magnetic, his presence undeniable. Unlike many aristocrats of his age, Hannibal did not lead from behind. He rode with his cavalry, slept in the same conditions as his men, and showed a relentless energy that inspired confidence. To his soldiers he was not only a general but a comrade, one whose courage matched his commands. This bond between commander and army would prove crucial, for Hannibal was destined to attempt feats no ordinary leader would dare to dream. The spark of war with Rome came from a city called Saguntum, a Roman ally on the fringes of Carthaginian influence in Spain. When Hannibal laid siege to Saguntum, he knew what he was unleashing. The attack was more than a tactical maneuver, it was a declaration. Rome demanded his surrender, but Carthage refused to hand him over. The die was cast. The Second Punic War had begun, and Hannibal was at its heart. He did not intend to fight Rome on terms chosen by others. He envisioned something audacious, to carry the war across mountains and rivers, into the very soil of Italy itself, to strike at Rome where it least expected, to make the Republic tremble. His plan was as bold as it was dangerous. Instead of meeting Rome in Spain or defending Carthage's homeland in Africa, he would lead his army across the Pyrenees, through Gaul and over the towering Alps, to descend into Italy like a storm. No one before him had attempted such a feat with a full army, complete with cavalry and even war elephants. It was a gamble that seemed impossible, a march that defied reason. Yet Hannibal was not a man who sought safety. He sought greatness. The march began with tens of thousands, infantry, cavalry, and elephants, moving northward, a living tide of men and beasts. They faced hostile tribes, harsh terrain, and the endless challenge of supply. But the most daunting test lay ahead: the Alps. These mountains rose like walls between Hannibal and Italy, their peaks shrouded in snow, their passes narrow and treacherous. The crossing was not merely a physical challenge, but a psychological one. Men muttered of doom, of gods who cursed their endeavor. Yet Hannibal stood unshaken. He rallied his men with words and presence, urging them to see beyond the suffering, to envision the prize, the fertile plains of Italy, the heart of Rome's power, ripe for conquest. The crossing was brutal. Ice and rock claimed lives at every step. Avalanches buried men and animals alike. The cold bit into flesh and spirit, while hostile tribes harried them from the heights. Horses stumbled and fell into ravines. Elephants collapsed under the strain, and soldiers froze in the bitter winds. But Hannibal pressed forward, refusing to allow despair to overwhelm his army. He was everywhere, helping clear paths, encouraging the weary, chastising the fearful. He was not only a strategist but a force of will, and it was his determination that kept the army alive. After weeks of unimaginable hardship, Hannibal and the remnants of his force descended into Italy. From the tens of thousands who had begun, many were lost, but those who remained were hardened, tempered like steel by suffering. They were no longer merely soldiers. They were instruments of Hannibal's will, ready to strike at the heart of Rome. When news reached Rome that Hannibal had crossed the Alps, disbelief turned to alarm. No enemy in centuries had dared invade the Italian peninsula on such a scale. Rome braced for battle, but it had yet to comprehend the brilliance of the general it now faced. For Hannibal, the crossing was not the end but the beginning. He had accomplished the impossible, and in doing so, he had changed the balance of power. The stage was set for a series of battles that would echo through history. Battles where Hannibal would demonstrate not only his daring, but his genius. The first clash came on the banks of the river Trebia, where Hannibal's outnumbered force lured the Romans into a trap. Hidden cavalry struck from ambush, and the Roman legions were cut to pieces. It was a stunning victory, one that announced Hannibal's presence with thunder. But it was only the beginning, for greater triumphs lay ahead, and Rome's nightmare was only just beginning to unfold. The victory at the Trebia sent shockwaves across Italy. Rome, a republic that prided itself on discipline and resilience, had been humiliated in its own land. Yet the Romans were not a people who surrendered easily. They raised new armies with astonishing speed, consuls eager to reclaim their honor and avenge the defeat. Hannibal understood this rhythm of Roman war. He knew that they would come at him again, as relentless as the tide, their legions rebuilt and their confidence restored. What they did not know, however, was that he had no intention of meeting them in straightforward battle. He thrived on misdirection, on turning strength into weakness, and he would teach Rome that victory was not merely a matter of numbers. Winter descended on Italy, but Hannibal's army endured, surviving on cunning as much as supplies. He fed his men by raiding, by foraging, by living off the land that now trembled under his presence. The Italians watched with unease. Some tribes welcomed him, hoping to break free from Rome's domination. Others feared him, clinging closer to the republic that had long held them in its orbit. Hannibal's campaign was more than a clash of armies. It was a struggle for allegiance, a contest to see who would hold the loyalty of Italy's diverse peoples. Spring brought new challenges, and with them, a new opportunity for Hannibal to demonstrate his genius. Near the shores of Lake Trasimene, in the mist-shrouded hills of Etruria, he laid a trap unlike any other. The Romans marched with confidence, unaware that they were stepping into a carefully prepared snare. Hannibal had studied the land, understood the terrain, and turned nature into his ally. He placed his troops in hidden positions along the hillsides, cavalry poised to strike, infantry concealed in ambush. The lake lay on one side, the ridges on the other, leaving the Romans a narrow path, a corridor of doom. When the Roman column entered, Hannibal gave the signal. From the fog, from the slopes, from every side his forces surged forward. Chaos erupted as legionaries were struck before they could form lines, as cavalry thundered into their flanks, as spears and arrows rained down from above. The lake offered no escape, the hills no refuge. It was not merely a battle, it was a massacre. Entire units were annihilated before they realized they were fighting. Consul Gaius Flaminius himself fell in the fighting, his death sealing the catastrophe. In a matter of hours, the Roman army was destroyed, tens of thousands cut down, drowned, or scattered. The defeat at Trasimene stunned Rome. Never in its history had it suffered such devastation from a single engagement. But Hannibal was not finished. He sought not just victory, but the breaking of Rome's spirit. To his men, he was a figure of unshakable will, guiding them through hardship with the promise of triumph. To his enemies, he was a shadow looming over their fields, unpredictable and terrifying. Rome's response was desperate. They appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, a man of patience and caution. Fabius would become known as the cunctator, the delayer, for his strategy was to avoid pitched battles with Hannibal, to wear him down, to bleed his strength slowly by denying him decisive encounters. For Hannibal, this new approach was vexing. He thrived on battle, on maneuvers that turned the Roman hunger for glory into their undoing. But Fabius refused to play that game. He shadowed Hannibal's army, cut off supplies where possible, scorched the earth ahead of his path, but never committed to a confrontation. The Romans hated this strategy, calling Fabius cowardly, but Hannibal recognized the danger it posed. His enemies were learning, the Republic was adapting, and yet the political pressure within Rome was too great. The people demanded action, demanded revenge, demanded the annihilation of Hannibal's army. The stage was set for one of the most famous battles in history. In 216 BCE, near a small Apulian town called Cannae, the two forces prepared for a confrontation that would echo for millennia. Rome assembled an army greater than any it had fielded before, perhaps as many as 80,000 infantry and cavalry, a vast host meant to overwhelm by sheer force of numbers. It was the embodiment of Roman confidence. If one army fell, another would rise larger and more determined. They believed no enemy could withstand such massed power. Hannibal, however, was not intimidated. He understood not just numbers, but how men moved, how fear spread, how discipline could be turned against itself. He saw the Roman legions not as an unstoppable machine, but as a weapon he could bend back upon its wielder. The morning of battle dawned hot and dusty. Hannibal arrayed his forces in a formation that puzzled his opponents. He placed his weaker troops, the Gauls and Spaniards, in the center, forming a bulge that jutted toward the Romans. On the wings, he stationed his hardened African infantry, disciplined and deadly. His cavalry, commanded with precision, took positions on the flanks. To Roman eyes, the formation looked vulnerable, as though Hannibal had exposed his weakest troops to the brunt of their assault. It was an illusion, crafted with purpose. When the battle began, the Romans hurled their weight at the center, pressing hard, driving into the bulge. Hannibal's line bent, slowly giving ground, retreating in controlled rhythm. It seemed as though the Romans were breaking through, victory within their grasp. But as the center yielded, the flanks began to curve inward like jaws closing around prey. Hannibal's Africans swung in from both sides, their discipline unshaken, their blades striking with precision. Meanwhile, his cavalry had already driven off the Roman horsemen and now wheeled behind the enemy. In an instant, the Romans found themselves encircled, trapped in a tightening ring of steel. Panic spread through the packed legions as realization dawned. There was nowhere to run, no space to maneuver. Men were crushed together so tightly they could not lift their swords, suffocated by the press of their comrades, cut down in waves as Hannibal's soldiers methodically tightened the noose. What had begun as an overwhelming attack had become a slaughter. By the day's end, tens of thousands of Romans lay dead, perhaps as many as 50,000 in a single battle. Never before had the Republic suffered such a loss. Never before had one man inflicted such destruction upon their mighty legions. The field of Cannae was more than a battlefield. It was a graveyard of Roman pride. Survivors carried the horror back to Rome, where the city was gripped by despair. Yet even in this moment of devastation, Rome revealed its resilience. Lesser powers might have sued for peace, might have bowed before Hannibal's might, but the Republic refused. They swore never to negotiate while Hannibal remained on Italian soil. It was a vow of defiance that astonished even their enemies. Hannibal had won the greatest tactical victory in history, but he had not yet broken the Roman will. Still, the impact of Cannae was immense. Many Italian allies wavered, some defecting to Hannibal's side. Cities opened their gates, believing Rome's days were numbered. The southern regions of Italy trembled with shifting loyalties. Hannibal established his base in Capua, a wealthy city that welcomed him as a liberator. For a moment, it seemed as if Rome truly stood on the brink of collapse, one more blow away from ruin. Hannibal had done what no enemy had ever accomplished. He had brought the Republic to its knees in its own homeland. Yet even in triumph, questions lingered. Hannibal had the power to devastate Rome in battle, but could he destroy Rome itself? The city still stood, its walls unbreached, its senate unbroken. Victory in the field was not the same as victory in the war, and though the path ahead seemed open, it would prove more difficult than even Hannibal could have imagined. In the aftermath of Cannae, the air in Italy was thick with uncertainty. Rome had been struck a blow so severe that many believed its end was inevitable. Allies whispered of defection, envoys from Carthage urged Hannibal to press forward, and the world watched, waiting for the final collapse of the Republic. Yet Hannibal did not march on Rome itself. Instead, he sought to break Rome's power, not through a siege, but through the slow unraveling of its alliances. For he knew the city's strength did not lie in walls alone, but in the vast web of peoples and allies who filled its armies, fed its citizens, and gave it dominion over Italy. To strike at Rome was to strike at an idea, and Hannibal believed the cracks in that idea could be widened into ruin. Capua became his new base, a wealthy city that opened its gates after Cannae, welcoming him with feasts and promises. To his weary soldiers, it was a respite from years of hardship. To Hannibal, it was a symbol of victory, proof that Rome's allies could be won over. Yet resting in Capua came at a cost. His army, accustomed to hardship and discipline, now tasted luxury. For his enemies, the pause bought time to regroup, to raise new legions, to rally the people of Rome with defiance rather than despair. The city's leaders refused to bow, and even in the face of catastrophe, the Senate projected calm determination. They forbade mourning in public, as if to deny Hannibal the satisfaction of seeing them broken. They ordered new armies, new consuls, new strategies. Where others might have surrendered, Rome dug in. As the months passed, Hannibal's hopes of mass defections across Italy proved only partly fulfilled. Some regions shifted loyalties, but many remained bound to Rome, fearful of retribution or loyal to the Republic's stubborn spirit. Hannibal roamed the Italian countryside for years, striking where he could, devastating Roman fields, burning crops, luring legions into traps. His maneuvers were brilliant, his ambushes devastating, yet the tide of the war began to change in ways even he could not easily counter. For Rome had learned from its mistakes. No longer did it rush blindly into his snares. Instead, under the lingering influence of Fabius Maximus, it pursued a war of attrition. Roman armies shadowed Hannibal's movements, refusing decisive battle, cutting off his supplies, harassing his foragers. Where once they had charged with reckless pride, now they stalked with patience, forcing him to bleed slowly. And though Hannibal could still win victories, each triumph seemed to bring him no closer to the final blow he needed. The wider Mediterranean, too, shaped the course of the war. In Spain, where Hannibal's brothers held command, Roman generals struck hard, slowly seizing ground. Carthaginian reinforcements were delayed, diverted, or destroyed. In Sicily, Rome fought to secure its grain, preventing Hannibal from drawing strength from across the sea. Carthage itself, though proud of Hannibal's triumphs, failed to give him the overwhelming support he needed. The Carthaginian Senate, divided and cautious, sent troops sparingly, unwilling or unable to match Rome's relentless mobilization. Hannibal, the greatest general of his age, found himself isolated, his brilliance unmatched but his resources dwindling. Still, his campaigns in Italy were extraordinary. He marched from south to north, from the plains of Apulia to the hills of Campania, always maneuvering, always confounding his enemies. He won battles at Herdonia, at Silarus, at countless smaller encounters where his tactical genius shone. His cavalry, led by the Numidian horsemen, darted across the fields, striking with speed and vanishing before the Romans could respond. His infantry, hardened by years of struggle, remained loyal, even as the odds shifted. Yet for all his victories, the walls of Rome never fell, and the Republic's will never cracked. Years stretched into more than a decade, and Hannibal became a fixture in Italy, a ghost that haunted the Roman imagination. Children grew up under the shadow of his name. Senators debated how to rid themselves of him. Generals hesitated to face him. His very presence was a weapon, forcing Rome to pour its strength into defending its homeland. But Rome was a power of vast resources, a state that could endure even the greatest disasters, so long as its will remained unbroken. Slowly, inexorably, the balance shifted. In Spain, Roman generals such as the brothers Publius and Gnaeus Scipio gained ground against Carthaginian forces, cutting off Hannibal from his lifeline. When they fell in battle, another Roman would rise, one who would become Hannibal's greatest adversary, Publius Cornelius Scipio, later known as Scipio Africanus. This young commander studied Hannibal's methods, admired his brilliance, and sought to match him on the battlefield. While Hannibal maneuvered across Italy, Scipio began dismantling Carthage's empire abroad. For Hannibal, the years of wandering Italy became a test of endurance. He knew that time was his enemy. Each season that passed without decisive victory strengthened Rome's grip. He urged Carthage for reinforcements, for men, for supplies, but what arrived was always too little, too late. His brothers attempted to bring aid, but Roman arms cut them down before they could join him. Hasdrubal, leading an army across the Alps as Hannibal once had, was defeated at the Metaurus, his head thrown into Hannibal's camp as grim proof of Rome's determination. The dream of reinforcement was shattered, leaving Hannibal to face the future alone. Yet his spirit did not falter. Even as the noose tightened, even as Rome reclaimed allies and cities, Hannibal remained elusive, always one step ahead, always ready with a stratagem that kept the legions wary. His men still followed him with loyalty, hardened by years of shared struggle. To his enemies he was a phantom they could not banish, a living reminder of their vulnerability. To history he became the embodiment of perseverance, of genius that defied the odds. But Hannibal understood what his soldiers did not always see. Victory at Cannae had been the high tide of his fortunes, and now the waters were receding. Rome's resilience was something no calculation could have predicted, no stratagem could undo. He had fought the greatest battles of antiquity, demonstrated brilliance unmatched by any general before or since, yet the Republic stood. The war was shifting beyond Italy, into Spain, into Africa, and eventually it would force him to leave the land he had haunted for so long. Still, as the years passed and Rome clawed back its strength, Hannibal remained unyielding. He had sworn as a boy never to be a friend of Rome, and that oath burned within him still. His campaign in Italy was not simply war, it was destiny, a struggle that defined his life. Though the outcome grew increasingly uncertain, though Rome proved indomitable, Hannibal's shadow continued to fall across the Republic, a constant reminder that even the mightiest empire could tremble before the genius of one man. The years in Italy had tested Hannibal's resolve, but even as he endured, the world beyond his campaign was shifting in ways that would ultimately decide the fate of the war. Rome, though bloodied, refused to break. Its legions continued to march, its allies were gradually drawn back into its orbit, and its enemies fell one by one. In Spain, a young commander emerged, whose name would forever be linked with Hannibal's own, Publius Cornelius Scipio. Scipio was not yet the hero Rome would come to celebrate, but his early campaigns revealed both courage and brilliance. He had grown up in the shadow of Hannibal's terror, a boy whose city had nearly fallen, whose father and uncle had been killed in Spain by Carthaginian forces. Instead of despair, he turned that history into determination. In Spain, he struck hard against Carthage, seizing city after city, driving out Hannibal's brothers, and eventually capturing New Carthage, the jewel of their Spanish empire. With that victory, Rome severed Hannibal's strongest lifeline. The loss of Spain was devastating. The silver mines, the manpower, the strategic depth, all slipped from Carthage's grasp. Hannibal remained in Italy, still undefeated in open battle but increasingly isolated. His letters to Carthage grew more urgent, pleading for reinforcements, for supplies, for anything that might shift the tide. Yet the Senate in Carthage hesitated, divided between factions, weary of the war, reluctant to commit resources that seemed only to vanish into the maw of conflict. For all his brilliance, Hannibal was a general stranded, forced to wage war without the full weight of his city behind him. Rome, by contrast, had found its savior in Scipio. After conquering Spain, Scipio turned his eyes to Africa itself. It was a daring plan to strike Carthage directly, to bring the war to the very heart of Hannibal's homeland. Where Hannibal had carried fire into Italy, Scipio would carry it into Carthage. The Senate, cautious but persuaded, granted him command, and soon Roman legions sailed across the Mediterranean to the shores of North Africa. The war, once fought in the hills and plains of Italy, was now moving to its final stage. In Africa, Scipio proved himself a master of diplomacy as well as war. He forged alliances with local kings, winning the support of Numidia, whose cavalry would play a decisive role in the battles to come. With these reinforcements, his army grew not only in size but in versatility, a mirror of the very strategies Hannibal had once used to confound Rome. The student, in many ways, was learning from the master, even as he prepared to face him. For Carthage, Scipio's invasion was an existential threat. The city could no longer ignore the war or treat it as something distant. Rome stood on African soil, and Carthage itself was in peril. At last, the call went out for Hannibal to return. After more than 15 years in Italy, after victories and hardships, triumphs and struggles, Hannibal was summoned home. It was a bitter moment. He had dedicated his life to bringing Rome to its knees, had come closer than any enemy ever would. Yet now he was forced to leave the land where he had carved his legend. His soldiers wept, for they knew their long campaign was ending, not with the conquest of Rome, but with a retreat. Hannibal, however, accepted his fate. He had sworn never to be Rome's friend, and now he would meet his greatest rival on the fields of Africa. The final act of this struggle unfolded near the town of Zama in 202 BCE. There, Hannibal and Scipio faced one another for the first and only time. The encounter was more than a battle between armies. It was a clash between two visions of war, two generations of genius. Before the fight, legend tells of a meeting between the commanders, where Hannibal, seasoned by decades of struggle, looked upon the young Roman with respect. He had seen many men, many generals, but in Scipio he recognized something rare, a mind that matched his own. On the morning of Zama, Hannibal arrayed his forces with the skill that had made him feared for so many years. He placed his elephants at the front, hoping their charge would shatter Roman lines, just as they had terrified enemies in Italy. Behind them stood his infantry, veterans who had marched with him across the Alps, men who had followed him through victory and defeat. His cavalry, however, was outnumbered, for the Numidians now rode with Scipio. Their loyalty turned. It was a shift that would prove decisive. As the battle began, the elephants charged forward, but Scipio had prepared his men well. Instead of panicking, the Romans opened lanes through their ranks, guiding the beasts harmlessly past with shouts and spears. The charge faltered, the animals scattered, and Hannibal's opening gambit failed. The infantry clash that followed was brutal, a grinding struggle of shield against shield, spear against sword. Hannibal's veterans fought with ferocity, pushing back the Romans with the strength of experience. For a time it seemed as though the old general might triumph once more, but the battle was not decided in the center. On the flanks, Scipio's cavalry, reinforced by the Numidians, overwhelmed Hannibal's horsemen. They pursued them off the field, then wheeled back, striking the rear of Hannibal's army just as the Romans pressed forward from the front. It was the very maneuver Hannibal had used at Cannae, now turned against him. Encircled, his soldiers fought with desperate courage, but the trap closed tighter. Where once Hannibal had orchestrated the perfect destruction of a Roman army, now he tasted the same fate. By day's end, the field belonged to Rome. Hannibal, though alive, was defeated. Carthage sued for peace, forced to surrender its navy, its empire, and its pride. The war was over, and with it ended Carthage's dream of supremacy. Rome stood ascendant, master of the Western Mediterranean, its path to empire clear. For Hannibal, the defeat was a wound that never healed. He had faced Scipio with all the skill of a lifetime, and though he lost, he did not lose honor. Even his enemy recognized his greatness. When asked who was the greatest general in history, Hannibal is said to have named Alexander, then Pyrrhus, and only then himself. Yet history remembers differently. For though Alexander conquered and Pyrrhus intrigued, It was Hannibal who marched across the Alps, who annihilated armies many times his size, who brought Rome to the brink of ruin and held it there for more than a decade. His genius was undeniable, his legacy eternal. Defeat at Zama did not end Hannibal's story. Though Rome had stripped Carthage of its empire, reduced its fleet and demanded crushing tribute, Hannibal himself remained. To the Romans, he was still a figure of dread, a name whispered with unease. They had won the war, but they had not broken the man who had carried fire into their heartland for so long. In Carthage, Hannibal returned not as a fallen commander, but as a statesman. His people still revered him, for even in defeat, he had preserved their city when others might have lost everything. Elected as suffet, Carthage's highest magistrate, Hannibal turned his brilliance from war to politics. He reformed Carthage's finances, rooting out corruption, reorganizing the tax system, and ensuring the city could pay its tribute to Rome without descending into ruin. Under his guidance, Carthage began to recover, its commerce revived, its pride slowly rekindled. But his very success alarmed the Romans. To them, Hannibal's survival was intolerable. They feared not only his sword, but his mind. A man who could marshal armies, who could rebuild a humbled city, who could inspire loyalty across nations, was too dangerous to be left unchallenged. Rome demanded his surrender, but Carthage hesitated. Hannibal, sensing the net closing around him, chose exile. He slipped away, beginning a restless journey that carried him from court to court across the Mediterranean. Wherever Rome had enemies, Hannibal appeared, offering his counsel, his strategies, his genius. He traveled first to Tyre, then to Antioch, serving under Antiochus III, the Seleucid king who dreamed of resisting Rome's rise. Hannibal advised him, urged him to strike boldly, to use the tactics that had once humbled the legions. Yet Antiochus lacked Hannibal's daring. He hesitated, fought half-heartedly, and was defeated. Once again Rome's shadow lengthened, and Hannibal was forced to flee. From Syria he journeyed to the court of Prusias, king of Bithynia in Asia Minor. There he continued to serve as an advisor, waging small wars against Rome's allies, always the thorn in the Republic's side, always defiant. But the reach of Rome was vast, its influence growing with each passing year. Senators in the capital could not rest while Hannibal still breathed. They pressed their allies to hunt him, to surrender him, to extinguish the ember of defiance that he carried. For Hannibal, exile became a cage, each move bringing him closer to the inevitable. In the end, it was not battle that claimed him, nor capture, but choice. Surrounded by enemies, with Roman envoys demanding his surrender, Hannibal chose to deny them their prize. He had lived his life on his own terms, and he would not allow Rome the satisfaction of parading him in chains. Legend tells that he carried with him a vial of poison, a final safeguard against humiliation. When the time came, he drank it. As the poison coursed through his body, Hannibal spoke his last words, condemning Rome's fear. "Let us relieve the Romans of their constant dread of this old man." With that, he ended his life, not in defeat, but in defiance. So ended Hannibal Barca, the man who had marched across the Alps, who had annihilated Roman armies, who had terrified the mightiest republic of antiquity. His death was quiet, far from the battlefields where he had forged his legend. Yet his legacy endured. To Rome he remained the greatest enemy they had ever faced, a figure who haunted their memory for generations. To history, he became the archetype of the brilliant general, the strategist whose daring defied the possible. Hannibal's legacy lies not only in the battles he fought, but in the way he reshaped the art of war. At Trebia, at Trasimene, at Cannae, he demonstrated principles that generals would study for millennia: maneuver, deception, the use of terrain, the power of morale. His double envelopment at Cannae remains the textbook example of tactical genius still taught in military academies around the world. His march across the Alps stands as a symbol of audacity, of a will that refused to bow before nature itself. And yet his story is also one of tragedy. For all his brilliance, Hannibal could not overcome the resilience of Rome. His victories were unmatched, but they did not bring the final triumph he sought. His genius illuminated the heights of what a commander could achieve, but also revealed the limits of individual brilliance against the might of a united, unyielding state. Hannibal was a man who stood at the edge of possibility, who reached further than most dared, and in doing so showed both the power and the futility of greatness. In the centuries that followed, his name lived on. Roman generals studied him, emulated him, feared his ghost on every battlefield. Napoleon admired him, calling him one of the few true masters of war. Modern strategists trace their doctrines to his maneuvers, seeing in him the foundation of military science. To this day, his name conjures awe. The general who brought Rome to the brink, the commander who fought not merely with armies, but with vision. Hannibal's life was a journey defined by struggle, a boy sworn to eternal enmity, a commander who defied the impossible, a statesman who rebuilt a humbled city, an exile who refused submission. He was both conqueror and fugitive, both hero and outcast. His greatness lay not only in his victories, but in his unyielding spirit, a refusal to bend even in the face of overwhelming odds. The Mediterranean has long since changed. Empires have risen and fallen, yet the story of Hannibal endures. His march over the Alps remains etched in legend, his battles studied, his defiance admired. He was not the founder of an empire, nor the ruler of a vast dominion. What he left was something less tangible but more enduring, an example of courage, ingenuity, and relentless will. He showed the world what one man, armed with genius and determination, could achieve against impossible odds. And so, when we speak of the greatest generals in history, when we search through the annals of time for those who redefined the art of war, we return again and again to Hannibal Barca. For though he fell short of ultimate victory, though Rome endured, his shadow stretched across centuries. He was the general who made Rome tremble, the commander who defied the world, the man who turned war into legend. Hannibal, the son of Carthage, the scourge of Rome, the greatest general in history.